Well, hello, folks. Thank you guys for being here this evening on this cold and very snowy evening. We're excited to have Dr. Lisa Bennett here to share a little bit more about the power of movement and structure for children with ADHD. She's from Mind-Well Psychology, and we're very excited for her to be here to share with us. I'll
Thank
let you
you.
take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Tristan. And thanks to the community of viewers just for this call. I always feel like a workshop is truly a workshop, and that people bring their own expertise and life experiences to bear. So I hope we'll go through some concepts, and if there's room for discussion or questions in the chat, we'll find a way to manage those so that this is interactive. I'll introduce myself a little bit. Presently, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm 25 years in the field. My very first job with children was my hardest job, and I was a preschool teacher. And that taught me probably more than 5 years in grad school about how to manage kids and meet kids where they are. And I went from there to being a school psychologist, ultimately a licensed clinical psychologist. And so I care about this topic a lot, neuroatypicality in children and how to manage it so we optimize their development. I got connected with this wonderful group that works with reading skills and kids with different profiles. And in the idea of having a podcast or a workshop, we were kind of struggling with two concepts. One is, how busy should we keep our kids? How scheduled up should kids be? And then, the benefit of structure and a highly scheduled program for a child who has ADHD. And it kind of blended into one presentation nicely. So that's what I will try to cover tonight. I also come by this honestly. My son, who's now 24, was a markedly hyperactive child growing up. Diagnosed, he was the little guy who had a lot of great ideas, but he had to pace the classroom during circle time. He was constantly tapping. He'd get little marks for stepping out of line and blurting out answers. And so finding that teacher that had the right fit for him, that could see that as exuberance for learning and not just bad behavior, was something I spent years kind of experiencing personally. So this is near and dear to my heart. So Tristan, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so probably everyone on this call knows the basics about the ADHD diagnosis, but I want to conceptualize it from that perspective of a deficit in executive functioning. So most people are aware there's two types. There's the hyperactive, impulsive type of ADHD, and there's the foggy, inattentive type. The thing that binds them together conceptually that makes sense is it's the same deficit in the brain. The manager of attention is not working. It's like either the transmission or the alternator in your car that makes it switch gears effectively to the demands of the context. So, for the presentation, the child who's impulsive and hyperactive, they have a very difficult time settling down and conforming their behavior to the demands of like a traditional classroom. Everything to that child is firing all at once, and everything is of interest. They're just extra. And then the presentation that is more foggy and inattentive, these can be certainly very creative and talented young people, but they haven't learned how to harness that and manifest that intelligence in a way that's actionable in traditional environments like a classroom. And so they may get overlooked in a diagnosis because they rarely cause problems, but they certainly aren't achieving to their own cognitive potential in many cases. And I have a favorite analogy that I always share with families. If I have a little one who has an ADHD diagnosis and the family and even the child needs to come to understand that diagnosis, is the idea that there is an orchestra conductor who is missing. So I'll say to young people, you may have prodigy genius musicians playing their song in your head, but your conductor's not there. And so everyone's playing at different times and different volumes, and it doesn't come out in an integrated way. And what we want to do is support that conductor function so that everything is lining up and making sense, and you can show your talent, let it show up at school or at home. Okay, Tristan, we can go to the next slide. All right. So along with that, with the different types of the ADHD profile. I think teachers, OT specialists, people who think about sensory items that you can buy to supplement a kid's experience in school. I'm always thinking about, what gear is this kid in? So you might have, and this sometimes maps onto the inattentive type and the hyperactive type, but it's not one to one in its relationship. You might have a gear one kid where if you can keep their learning environment calm, quiet, low stim, reduce distractions, let them work in a solitary fashion, that's what they need to sort of internally organize and perform well in school. I call them like a gear one kid. Don't overwhelm them. Don't have too many things going on at once. I know, my children went to a elementary school that was designed in the 70s as an open school, and every classroom was an open classroom. They were just like pods, but you could hear the lessons in other classrooms. And I knew for me, I would not have been able to learn that way. I couldn't filter down and just focus on what my teacher was saying if I had a ghost voice of a teacher in another space. So for Gear One learners, it's narrowing the field of stimulation. However, you also have kids that stall out if they're not adequately stimulated. And this was more like my guy or a lot of hyperactive kids. He needed juice. He needed to be in gear four to properly perform. And I think you see this with some um, impulsive children and hyperactive children. Some say they're sensation seeking children. So these are kids who need to move. They might be the kid who, just is always kind of trying to stand at their desk or chew on their pencil. This might be a teenager who's like, I actually study better if I have some music on, if I can kind of keep all my wheels running. That gives my brain the juice it needs for me to be at my best. So I think whenever you're talking about accommodations, you're talking about best study environment for kids, I always say there is nothing that is sacrosanct. There's no one right study room setup or set of 504 accommodations. You've got to know which type of ADHD they have and then what gear they like to operate in. And I think that that can be very informative. It's also important to think about what is often deemed bad behavior. So if you have a kid who is sensation seeking and they might blurt out questions or want to talk to their neighbor or get up or wiggle out of line, for that teacher to know they're not being defiant necessarily. They're being briefly obedient, but they can't hold it together. But they're in gear four and they're doing the best they can to manage all that neuromuscular energy that they are experiencing. Um, so I hope that that makes sense and we can talk about that. So that dovetails nicely into this idea of exceptionalities. I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of bell curve. But the idea that there is something different about a kid can be different strong or different vulnerable. You could be at the tail end of a bell curve on being very high in intelligence, high in athletic talent, precocious, very skilled. And, the shape of a bell curve, as most people know from statistics, is a lot of people are average. There's a lot of cluster right around the middle, and there's only a tail of kids who might have an IQ at a certain level or athleticism at a certain level. And the same is true, this bell curve, in terms of what is outlier problematic or underdeveloped or a vulnerability. And I think it's always important that people consider the idea that a child can be twice exceptional. And I feel like this is quite true of the population of kids I see, especially in Northern Virginia, often from high achieving families, that you can have a child who's quite bright, but there's a glitch somewhere in their development. And their other exceptionality is that their brain doesn't have the pegs to hold on to phonics, and they're found to be dyslexic. So they're both very bright and they have a learning disability, and that's being called twice exceptional. Or they're quite bright and they struggle with ADHD. And unfortunately, I think everyone knows that, to run a classroom or to run a school, a lot is geared towards those kids who are in the well-rounded middle. And so the kids who are twice exceptional are kind of doubly out of gear. They might be understimulated cognitively, or they might be overwhelmed with the demands for conformity in their behavior, desk sitting, staying in the line, and the like. So programming for a kid who's twice exceptional hopefully takes a very positive, curative relationship with a classroom teacher or a team so they can program effectively for those little individuals. Um, and with that, I always like to consider whether an exceptionality on either end of the bell curve, if you looked at it like their calling or their superpower, how might you understand this? So, if you have a kid who's hyperactive and is a real wiggle worm, there is a possibility that this is going to blossom into incredible athleticism, speed, physical agility, and it might be a talent. Um, the fidgety kid who can't stop moving their hands. This was my son's story. He would tap everybody. He wasn't allowed to sit in circle time because he'd be all over the little kids. He would fidget and make noise. Um, we ultimately just said, look, he's got to move his hands. Let's put him in drumming. And then he became a snare drummer and ultimately ended up drumline captain at UVA. It became his standout talent and his thing that he loved to do, and a place where he made friendships and assumed leadership. And we just embraced the fact that he needs to move this way. Let's turn it into a superpower. Um, some of our other neuroatypical children, you'd say they're outside the box thinkers. If you think of that as a future artist or poet, or even kids who hyperfixate and have very narrow interests or stereotyped interests. Sometimes you'll see that with kids on the autism spectrum. This might be someone who discovers something in science or would invent something someday. So I think probably most people who are on this call are open-minded already to differences and different learning profiles. But I really do like to pose that to families directly and say, what if this is a future superpower? How would we program around that and support some of this, atypicality or exceptionality a different way? Krista, we can go to the next one. Okay, so this slide is about how busy should we keep kids? And this dovetails to that original question about the focus of the presentation. There's so much debate about how much we schedule kids up, especially in these times and in a high achieving community like Northern Virginia. It's widely debated. How much should we be supervising kids? How many activities, how many sports should they be in? Should we allow them to kind of free range it or not? And when I've talked with Tristan and the team before, I will talk about this polarity in parenting styles that I think is pretty fascinating. I'm 55, so I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I'm what's called feral Gen X. We were left alone. I was a latchkey kid. We found our way in the afternoon, a lot of play outdoors, coming and going. And that was wonderful in some ways, and there was a lot of exploration, but it also invited certain risk factors. And I would say the pole has shifted in the other direction, and now people are kind of heavily involved, or what's called helicopter parenting on their kids. And I see it as a real cultural swing. I think, my personal experience was I actually wanted to be more structured and supervisory than my parents were, because I did worry about the risk factors that go along with a lack of supervision. But this gets widely debated. What's better? Shouldn't we let kids just get dirty and find out life lessons on their own, or how much do they need to be scheduled up? So one goes to the data. And there is a study that was done, a long-term study in Iceland. It's called the Iceland model. Now it's widely referenced. And in Iceland, they found that their teenagers were abusing drugs and were more depressed than teenagers in other countries. And so Iceland decided to create a big initiative and schedule their teenagers up. And so it became a national initiative. The teenagers would be involved in activities through the afternoon, arts, sports, what have you, but an activity with a method, a teaching pedagogy, and adult present. And the results in psychological outcomes for the kids in Iceland were really dramatic. I believe there's data that when they first started this initiative, I think it was in the 1990s, daily, no, rates of teenagers who said they'd been drunk in the last 30 days was roughly 40%. And after they did this initiative and they redid the survey 15 to 20 years later, the rate was down to 5%. It was this enormous effect size. And substance abuse had dramatically decreased because the kids were busy. And there were similar statistics about smoking. The rates for daily smoking in teens went from something like 23 to 25% down to 3 to 5%. So this particular study just gets a lot of press and is heralded as an example of the benefits of structure through childhood and even into adolescence. It's the question of how busy are our kids, or are they overscheduled, has also been looked at domestically here. There's one meta-analysis I've talked about before, which I think, I don't know if it was Yale, but an academic center surveyed 1,100 children in the US, and they took a very specific time diary of those children. And they found that the higher the time demand of activities had a positive statistical correlation with benefits, like grades going up and psychological stability. And there was just no statistical relationship. It was like a nothing burger in terms of a correlation with negative outcomes like resentment or anxiety or a sense of pressure. So that was kind of surprising to the academics that did that study. But there's always this question of how much is too much. And I think, especially in communities that are high achieving, or there's an expectation that kids will compete in sports to the point that they're being recruited or getting on travel teams, or that by the senior year of your high school, you're really taking almost all college level courses. If you come from a community that has a lot of pressure like that, certainly there is evidence that the pressure can be felt by kids. And that's something we can unpack a little bit, is how do you discern if you've overdone it? Tristan, you want to go to the next one? Okay, so this is common sense for kids for whom movement is the intervention. I will tell you, talk therapy offers a ton to kids, but it is not the only game in town, and having insight about your behaviors isn't the only way you balance a child's nervous system. Physical activity is hugely important, and it can be all sorts of things. It doesn't have to be team sports, dance, team sports. Kids who are runners and swimmers, a nice advantage of that is a lot of these kids, if they have a lot of movement motivation in their body, some of them are working out before they go to school, and then they're sort of at a more even place when they're ready to hit the classroom. Even marching band is athletic. If you've seen kids practice for band, they're out in the heat on their feet carrying heavy instruments. So I always put a plug in for the athleticism of marching band. And there is an interesting study about the martial arts. There was a study in 2019 that looked at Taekwondo, specifically for Taekwondo for kids with ADHD. If anyone on this call has a kid who's done Taekwondo, it has a lot of character lessons, and they'll show respect for their teachers. And they do these little enactments with movement and words to work on character development. And then just the body input can be therapeutic. So there was this study in 2019. It can be found on the NIH website. And it said that Taekwondo, actually, they gave kids IQ tests who were doing Taekwondo, and they found their selective attention skills had improved. So it was at the level of neural pathway connections, Taekwondo was having a benefit. So, Tristan, if you want to move on. Okay. So movement is important. But the other theme is structure, right? So how does the day unfold? What is predictable? How much do we give a kid a tight calendar? And I think depending on the adaptability and temperament of your own child or your own student or your client, you can kind of tailor fit this to them. But obviously, there's tons of tools to use to put more structure around a child's understanding of their day. And I think of it as scaffolding around a building that's in construction. Kids don't have it inborn to know how to manage a complex to-do list. And so you have to put that scaffolding around them. So these are all the common sense things people do. The chart on the fridge, visuals in front of the door, backpack, mittens, coats, the things they need to see to know if they've done it. One of my favorite uh, bits of advice that I give when I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist for families where there's an ADHD youngster is the idea that movement is included in getting through a to-do list. So I will have a kid put on their bedroom door or the front door all the things they need to make sure they have. Keys to the house, lunch, homework, whatever it is. And there's a paper clip on the side of the list, and they move the paper clip down when they achieve each little step along the way. So that brings something physical into the moment and a sense of mastery over the steps. There's tons of little ways to do this, magnets, lots of things, but I like the paper clip method. One of the things with ADHD kids is if you can keep ADHD just ADHD, you're doing a good job, because there is a risk for ADHD kids that it can develop into oppositional defiant disorder. And if that gets worse, it can develop into conduct disorder. This doesn't happen for every youngster, but it is a pathway of vulnerability for kids who have ADHD. And it's largely understood to be because they feel out of sync with the demands of authority. Someone keeps coming back to them consistently, like, no, you got it wrong. No, you missed it. Why did you forget that? Cut it out. Stop talking. It's no, they hear no, no, wrong, wrong, wrong a lot. And if you grow up that way, you get a chip on your shoulder. And then you start to think, I'm tired of these adults and I'm smart. And what have they got to teach me? And then that oppositionality might start to emerge. And if that goes on, that can really turn into serious conduct problems. So part of structuring their mind is overdoing it with rehearsal of good manners, practicing and mirroring to them, rehearsing how to say thank you, how to apologize in a very concrete way. They may not get it by osmosis. You may really have to go through it with them. Um, Obviously, behavioral principles are key here. What I often say is it should be a much bigger deal when a kid does something right or makes progress than it is if they make a mistake. So I always say praise with emotion, but discipline like a robot, right? Have the big display and the eye contact and the heart-to-heart talk. And that was so great. Did you notice, kiddo? You did that so differently and you were able to shake off that loss, or you said sorry to your friend and I'm so proud of you. That's a sign of maturity. But then if they do a foul or they make a mistake, instead of inviting a kind of shaming or denigrating response, you just said, well, you know the rules. You did X, that means Y, and there's a consequence. And that keeping that emotionally neutral sometimes helps prevent the kid getting that chip on their shoulder or resenting you for setting limits. So that's just a little nugget I like to share. What goes along with that is work very hard to catch them being good. Say it out loud every time you're proud of them. When I have a therapy client enter my office, I say routinely, if a young person's in my room, we start off with strengths. What are you proud of? What did they do well? And we give that a lot of juice in their therapy sessions with me. So again, going along with reducing the oppositionality, you really have to think about two domains. If a child is beginning to become obnoxious or rebuff direction, which is you're going to have to up two things. You need to up the structure and the expectations and the consequences, but you have to up the warmth at the same time. Because if you're only warmth, they're going to run right over you. And if you're only discipline all the time, they're not motivated to please you and they'll just keep rebelling and you'll be in that negative punishment loop with them. So getting that balance right, the structure and the support, the love and the limits, it's not easy to get it right. And it takes some mindful consideration to do so. And then above all else, remember to just enjoy them. Have silly time. Have what's called Russell Barkley, has a canon of literature on ADHD children. I think he's at Mass General. He would talk about the importance of special time, which is just non-directive play, meeting the child where they are to make room in the day for some relationship repair. And the play should not turn into quizzing. The play should not turn into labeling or quizzes. You basically just parallel play with the child. And the most you're really allowed to do is say some I wonder statements like, huh, I wonder what that doll is going to do next, or I wonder what you're building. But it's to back way up and just meet them as a human being and be curious about their curiosity. Okay, Tristan, we can move on. Okay. These questions come to my attention when I work with ADHD kids, and there's always this question of, will the behavioral and the family interventions or the classroom accommodations be enough, or should we initiate medication? And I'm just sharing my decision tree here, but I am not offering advice. I'm not an MD. I'm a PhD psychologist, so I know the world of talk therapy and accommodations. I don't know the molecular action of medication. So always consult a pediatrician or a child psychiatrist. But I do invite families to track the response to medication very closely because a lot of times the pediatrician is seeing the kid maybe once every 6 weeks or 3 months to track the meds, but they're not the boots on the ground watching how they're doing. The parents and the teachers are. So you'll see these three types of responses. You'll see the instant, oh, silver bullet, like why didn't we put them on Ritalin 2 years ago? Result. It is a very stimulants, and now the range of medications that is much wider than just classic psychostimulants are understood to be a very effective class of medication. I've said before that I've been at conferences and I'll sit next to a psychiatrist and they'll be like, next to antibiotics working, stimulants just work. Like for some kids, it really turns it right around, and those kids deserve a chance to have a trial on that medicine if it's going to give them that kind of focus and self-control so they can achieve. So that's lovely when that occurs. However, there's these other categories that some kids try the meds, they go to the doctor, you pay for the meds, they have to tolerate the meds, and you just don't see difference. It's just a non-response or a nothing burger response. And then you have a decision as a family, is it worth continuing? And certainly there are the side effects to look out for. Most people who work with ADHD kids or have one know you're looking out for appetite reduction, being overstimulated or nervous on stimulants, disruptions to sleep, or rebound effects that the meds work, but then when they kind of crash off these quickly metabolized meds, you see kind of ugly behaviors at the end of the day, and you have to figure out how to manage that. Okay. So as we talk about activities, and this question of how much, is therapeutic for ADHD kids in particular, but just the normative population, keeping kids busy and structured, it kind of invites these growth moments when they are involved in activities. One is just the resilience and mental toughness that can come. I think this is kind of common sense from the ups and downs of being in a team sport. I was not a sporty kid growing up. In fact, I never did a team sport of any kind. I was always in drama and choir. Tristan and I have talked about loving choir. And so I was fascinated to raise sporty kids and actually see how psychological it was. And I now notice on TV when I watch football games, at the end of the game, there's usually a post-game interview on the field and with someone who just had a devastating loss, but you'll see them do cognitive therapy in the moment right there. They'll say, well, I was still grateful to be here. I'm proud that I put it on the field. I have a team that I care about. I know my coach will give me feedback, and they work themselves back into psychological resilience. And it's pretty remarkable. And so I think sometimes talk therapists forget that that's a part of these other life activities that is therapy too. Being plugged into activities also builds self-esteem with data. So there's a lot of talk about, praising your children and giving them encouragement as building self-esteem, but kids know the difference. If they actually came in first or second in something, that becomes a part of their identity in a way that is not just words. And so you look for that. You try to find out, where is my kid going to have that sense of mastery and success, especially if they struggle in school. They're going to need something else to hang their hat on as part of their identity. And so diving in as deeply as you can on those special talents outside of school can be profoundly therapeutic. I often say to forget this concept of well-rounded, that every kid is good, pretty good at everything, right? And we were raised and conditioned to think we had to be well-rounded. You should get all A's and B's, you should get good comments in every class, and you should do maybe some art and some physical activity and be good at all of it. And I candidly think it's a myth. I don't know many adults who feel well-rounded. I think we grow up and we figure out there's a couple domains in life that we're good at, and that becomes who we are. And so I do think if there's a question about overscheduling children, that you look for signs that they need to quit something, that this is no longer their jam. It's not what builds their self-esteem. They're not motivated to do it. It's not serving a purpose for them anymore. And to become a master in one thing, they're going to have to let go of some other things, which can be a hard choice for a parent who's maybe invested time and money in a certain kind of sports training or dance instruction or what have you, when to say goodbye to an activity. And that's, what the question is about letting your child quit. If you can see it as this, they're getting closer to understanding their skill set and narrowing in on the lane of what they know will give them great satisfaction and self-esteem, it's fair to let them narrow their interest. So this relates to the whole population of kids, but also ADHD kids. And that is, these are some of the themes that come up frequently with my therapy clients. So I would be happy to entertain any questions or comments from the group. And that's my contact info.